In this session, we are going to talk about how to manage users in Nerdio for Azure. This is certainly one of the richest and most important topics, as users form the basis of so much that happens when interacting with Nerdio for Azure. You'll learn how to add a new user, edit a current user, and much more. Enjoy the session.
Let's move on to users. All right, so a lot of things happen on the user screen or in the users module, as we call it. You can see that's the very top module in the product, which means it gets used most commonly. You have your timestamp and the refresh button, which again indicates that this is a cached list. So always be mindful of that. If the list gets out of date, like if it gets old, I think after maybe 24 hours, I don't remember the exact time frame, but there is a certain amount of time frame when we mark this as stale, in which case this will turn red. So if you come into a screen and this is red, something is not right. Either the domain controller is inaccessible or something is unable to refresh the list. So a red timestamp is an alert that you need to investigate. Okay, then the next thing I want to show you before we dig into the actions is this little settings gear up here on the top right. And what this does is it lets you filter the view of this list. Okay, this is a non-persistent setting, which means that you click on it and then any changes that you make, you want to make a change. But by default, all of these are turned off, meaning any users who are disabled will not be visible, any users who are archived, any users who, so archived and disabled users is if you want to show those in addition to the active users. The last two filters is if you want to show only admin users or only people with desktops assigned. So we'll go through what that means exactly in a bit, but just so you know, if you're not seeing somebody, then you want to make sure that your filters are set correctly. Like if they're disabled or an archive user, you should not see them in the default list. You'd have to enable that. So let's go ahead and turn on disable, turn on archive, and boom, we have a user named Sally Sales. She has a little icon right here that says she's archived. It's a different color, and that's why she popped up on the list just now. And her actions are a little bit different than what you see for other users. Okay, so be aware of this filter right there. Okay, let's look at editing or adding a new user. So to edit the user, just click on the name or select edit from the screen. And edit user screen and add user screen are pretty much the same. So let's go ahead and add a new user and go through this in detail. So some of the things are pretty obvious. You know, there's first name, last name, there's email address, which is going to be the primary. And then remember, this is the default domain that I was referring to earlier. If we look at the dropdown, you'll see our other email domain that's available. Okay, so we can select either one. A mobile phone number here is, you know, just what it sounds. It goes into the mobile phone number field in Active Directory. And by default, or if someone has turned on Windows two-factor authentication, then this phone number will be used for SMS passcodes to be delivered to and will be enforced on their desktop login specifically. Okay, so we're going to have that number there. Okay, the next thing is the username. We spoke about this yesterday, but by default, every public email address is also a UPN in the local domain. So if this checkbox is checked, which it is by default, it's going to match the two, makes things really easy and simple. But it doesn't have to be the case. There's some situations where you may want to have an email address that doesn't necessarily match the username in Active Directory, in which case you can come in and look at that. We now not only have these two public domains, which are visible under email, but we also have this internal domain, which is not visible under email, right? So you can have a situation where you have a user that's got an internal login and an email address that are not the same. The next thing is Office 365. This refreshes along with the AD cache that gets refreshed on a regular basis. It pulls in all the Office 365 licenses. and it will list anything that's a supported license right here, allowing you to select and assign it. If you mouse over a particular SKU of Office 365, it will tell you how many have been purchased and how many have been assigned. If you don't have any available, which is obviously the difference between purchased and assigned, this will be grayed out. In this case, we have 2 available, so we could select it. Okay, now a word on Office 365 licenses. Office 365 licenses come in 2 flavors in app. They could be supported or unsupported. Okay, and what we mean by supported is a license that can actually be assigned by the NAP. For instance, anything that could be like, let's say, an E3 or E5 or Exchange Online Plan 1. Those types of licenses can actually be managed in the NAP, as opposed to some licenses that we call unsupported are ones that you can see them, meaning you can see that they're assigned, but you cannot actually assign or unassign them. So for example, we have this Andy IT admin. He's got Enterprise E3 assigned as a license, and then there's a little more button. If we click on more, we'll see that there is another SKU that's assigned to Andy, which is the Visio client, or whatever. This is the Visio Plan 1, I believe. But you can only view that it's assigned. You cannot unassign it or assign it to someone else. Okay, so that's what an unsupported license is all about. Okay, so let's keep going through this. We're adding a new user, phone number if needed, domain selection if we want, username if preferred, Office 365. You can also add additional email aliases. What happens here is that these, again, you have the option of which domain to use. And what's going to happen when this job is submitted, it's going to add these email addresses under the proxy addresses in the Active Directory object. And then when it syncs with Office 365 Azure AD, it's going to make that an alias for that particular user. So really easy to add additional aliases, as many as you want. Okay. Then the next section is user permissions. Okay, there are 2 configurable options here. One is, what are the permissions for the user for the NAP, right? What happens when the user logs into app.nerdio.net or the white label URL, which is the something.adminportal.pro. When they go to that URL and they type in their credentials, so jsmith at test5009.nerdio.net, and their password, what are they going to see? So if this checkbox is not checked, what they will get is a user portal, and we'll look at that in a little bit. And on the user portal, they have very limited options. They can download an RDP file, they can reset their session, but they cannot do any management of anyone's account other than their own. If you check the box, then you basically designate them as an administrator, and you're giving them 2 options. You can either make them an IT admin, which will give them access to all of these options. So when they log in with their credentials, they'll see everything here. Or you can make them a tier 1 support, which will give them everything up until servers, but nothing below that point. Okay, so that's what this checkbox is for. This checkbox is for granting the user admin rights on all the desktops. Okay, again, assuming that the configuration hasn't been messed with, assuming that all the security groups are intact. The way we provision things out of the box is there is a desktop admins domain group. That domain group is a member of the administrators group on each desktop resource, whether it's a VDI machine or an RDS session host. And by checking this box, we're dropping this AD user object into that security group, which then becomes a local administrator of all of the various desktops that are in place. So checking this will make a user a local administrator of desktops. There is another checkbox that actually used to be here to grant user domain admin rights. We've decided to hide it. I'm going to show you where it is so you know. It's under extended attributes all the way on the bottom. There is a checkbox that says grant domain admin rights. If you check it, it's going to give you a little warning. But what this will do is it will actually add the user to the domain admins security group in AD, making them a domain administrator. okay, which has obvious repercussions and different things, which is why we decided to hide it a little bit. Okay, then we get down to the desktop section. So the desktop section has 3 selections. None is obvious, okay? If you have none selected, the user doesn't consume a license of Nerdio. If you have VDI selected, that's also pretty straightforward. You have a selection of desktop sizes that are sort of curated by us for the customer, for the partner. Kind of the most common ones. You won't see every single instance here, only the ones that are likely to be desktops. And there's a little validation going on. You'll see some of these are grayed out because of insufficient core quotas, etc. But you can go ahead and you can change the instance size if you want it and set it to whatever that user needs, and always come back and change it later. Then there is a disk size. If you'll recall from our storage sessions, we have 3 types of storage. We have premium SSD, standard SSD, and standard HDD. You can select any one of those as a disk. And then if on-ramp regions are enabled, which is going to be a whole separate section we'll talk about in the future, you can decide what Azure region to place this specific desktop into. By default, it's going to go into the primary region, which for this account is South Central US. There is also an East US 2 on-ramp region that's been added, and you can actually check the box and select that region. And when the desktop VM gets created, it's going to be created in the East US region. It's going to be connected across a VPN to the rest of the environment, so the user can have it closer to where they are. Okay, that's VDI. RDS, this comes from, this shows you a list of available desktop resources. There are 2 classes of resources, either individual session hosts, which are cloned from RDSH01, which is the first one that we started with. And then there is also there's RDS collections, which is a collection of RDS session hosts that you can assign the user to. So you can select a resource to assign the user to, and it will tell you what region that resource happens to be in if on-ramp regions are enabled. Okay, the next section is more customizing the security rights and group membership for a user. This is a handy little box where you can type in a name of an existing user or maybe a template that you've set up that may be sitting disabled. So for instance, we have a template called new user template. You click on it, it will pre-populate any groups that template is a member of. Or let's say we have a user that's in accounting, we can select accounting, it will pre-populate all the user groups. The way these selection lists work, as you're familiar with, it's one of these things where you start typing and it matches it, and then you can just add groups really easily and quickly like this. Okay, let's expand. Oh, when you do copy from, it doesn't only copy the Active Directory groups, but it also copies certain parameters here, like for example, login script, if there is work number or website or street address, any of those fields that are filled out, it's going to copy certain ones of these, the ones that make sense. Obviously, the display name will not be copied. A quick word on display name. So you see this is basically first name, last name. As we change it, it should be changing it here, but sometimes you may want to override it. So let's say the display name for John Smith, maybe you just want it to be one word or whatever it is. Sometimes if you want to customize the display name, you don't want it to match the first and last name, you can come in and change it here. Unlike in Active Directory users and computers, where you actually have to click on the name, change the display name, and then it prompts you, hey, do you want to change first name, last name? Here, first name, last name shows up as the primary thing, and then you have to go under extended attributes to change the display name. Login script, I think it's pretty self-explanatory. We covered this organizational unit dropdown. So any OUs that reside within active users, maybe you configured it with custom GPOs, etc., would be available here. So you can go in and select the location for this object that we are currently creating. Okay, then X500 we're not going to cover. It's more for kind of exchange migration situations, etc. Then we have some boxes down here. We already spoke about grant domain admin rights, right? So you can check that or uncheck it if you want. There is a password never expires, which is checked right now because I'm copying from Angie Accounting, and I guess she had password never expired enabled. There's also user cannot change password that can be enabled if we want. There is this validation we spoke about earlier where it will validate that the user name and email address you're adding does not conflict something that already exists in Azure AD. If it's not in Azure AD, but it's in the Nerdio AD, it's going to be able to detect that right away. But if it's in Azure AD, it actually has to go into Azure AD and run a validation. So this box is checked by default. And if it's there, if it conflicts, you're going to get an error. If you want to override that validation, you just have to uncheck the box. And then there's also an option to hide the user from the global address list. And then finally, there is an optional email section where if you're adding a new user and you want to email them instructions on what to do next, you put in their personal email address. They get an email that could be white labeled for a particular partner that looks like this with some links, with an attached RDP file, and with their username, password, and server settings. Although, because there's an RDP file, this is more just for their record rather than anything they have to configure because there's an RDP file attached. Now, if we don't have a desktop assigned, you'll notice that the optional email option grayed out. There's nothing to send them because there's really no desktop for them to log into. Okay, so that is adding a new user. When you edit the user, the options are largely the same. They're pretty similar here, you can see. A couple of things to point out. There's some additional things you can do under extended attributes. You still have your domain admin rights, your validations, and your GAL. You also can disable OA and active sync if for whatever reason that was necessary. And if Office 365 MFA is enabled, you have the option to now come in and enable it for the user from this screen. We'll deal with MFA in a bit as well. So I'm gonna skip that for now. Let's look at a couple of additional things, and then we'll leave the rest for the next session. So enabling a user is as easy as selecting this drop down, right? So selecting it, disabling a user, selecting disable and clicking confirm will disable that user in Active Directory. And because we're using domain federation, then all sign-ins stop right away. If we're not using domain federation, if the domain is managed, then at the next synchronization, the user in Azure AD in Office 365 will be marked as blocked, right? So a disabled user in AD translates to a blocked user in Azure AD. There is also, I mentioned this yesterday, but I'll repeat it. There's a little lock next to each user's next to each user's name. If it's gray and unlocked, that means the user is unlocked. If it's red and locked, obviously it means it's locked. You can click on it, even if it's unlocked, because maybe it's a list that hasn't been refreshed or whatever. There may be some reason to force an unlock. So clicking on this brings up this box, and we can click OK, and that's going to go through and unlock that user. Now, note that I'm currently disabling this user. So given the fact that I have disabled users turned off, I'm not going to see Andy once this process is done. He's going to be hidden from the list. Although, when I want to enable him, I'm going to go and show disabled users and then use the same method for enabling him. Now let's do this. Let's select users who are admins only. So when we do that, what you'll see is Chat CEO popped up. The reason he popped up is because he has this little icon that's kind of inverted from what you've seen for the other users. And if we click on Chat CEO, you'll notice the Chat CEO is an account IT admin with this box checked. So sometimes as an administrator, you want to know, okay, well, who's got NAP admin rights? And this little filter helps you filter down just to those users. And then sometimes you also want to see just the users that have desktops. You may have 1,000 users and only 10 of them have desktops. So you would check this box and it will hide everyone else. In this case, all 3 of these users have a desktop assigned, which is why we are still seeing all of them on the screen.